About 8 years ago, I conducted a faith experiment on the land I call home. It's a land once stewarded by the Nipmuc, the Pawtucket, and the Massachusetts peoples. And my particular place is in a neighborhood whose streets, the names pay homage to both the natural setting, there's Ledgewood, Briarwood, Wildwood, and to its past as a colonized hunting ground. There's Fox Hill and Tally Ho and Redcoat. So there's this dual identity of colonized land with preserved natural forest. I imagine it's not too uncommon in these parts. The majority of the residents have what I would call a domination practice of land maintenance. They got manicured lawns, structured flower gardens, and out of what was once a vast forest, the trees form kind of a frame for these half-acre plots. And when my family and I moved there 13 years ago, that manicured is what the lawn looked like in front and back of our house. Suffice it to say, it no longer looks like that. So that gets me back to that experiment. It was about 5 years in, and I noticed the yard was not uniformly grassed anymore. I stopped using chemicals immediately when the previous owners had, I didn't, and that had an effect. So there seemed to be a lot of things growing there, and rather than just mowing over them this year, I decided, let's get curious. I want to know more about what all these things are that are growing. So I let them grow all spring long, and most of them through the summer. No weeding, no mowing, no attempts at dominating this land. Just unimpeded growth. I mean, after all, our faith calls us to dismantle systems of oppression in all forms, and we need to start somewhere. I mean, this was a system of oppression, so why not start with lawn maintenance and see where it goes? This was also a great test to see what my neighbors could tolerate. The yard was a mess. You probably understand what I'm talking about. It was patchy, it was weedy, it was wild. If you looked at the border on each side of the property, there was a stark difference. And all of that weedy mess threatened to creep into their side. As we know with those kind of plants, it probably already had. And I wish I could say that I had a long conversation about my faith and how I'm living out my faith by doing this with my neighbors, but in reality, we didn't talk about it. But they were also nice and they didn't raise any kind of stink. We just were civil neighbors moving ahead. So I was committed to living out this experiment as far as I could, as long as I could. Because it was grounded in my conviction that all plants have value, even when normally they'd be called weeds. Emerson famously said about a weed that it is a plant whose virtues have not yet been discovered. It's hard to do, Ralph, when these plants are a huge mess. Like, which ones have value? How do we figure that out? So wild growth in a culture that has control and domination over its land, wild growth is an enemy of that. They tell us that nature must be tame, but also beautiful and profitable and uniform and predictable. So taking a posture of dominance requires some violence with the nature. It requires a war on the unwanted, the weeds. We use harmful chemicals without regard to the secondary effects. It requires regular measured use of water for the favored, regardless of how others are going through maybe a drought or other damages to the ecosystem. Does not consider the relationships developed by plants with their surrounding. It does not imagine that plants could actually work together in mutual aid. Or contrarily, that when you introduce non-native flora, it could be dangerous to the landscape or poisonous. The suburbs where I live are literal battlegrounds for the war on weeds, and it seems like us landowners are the soldiers of these battlegrounds. Our duty is supposed to be to tame this landscape, to maintain appearances in order to keep a privileged status in the eyes of a dominant culture. So, this experiment I was doing was kind of countercultural. I chose peace with the land instead of war. Not be a soldier, but a co-journeyer on the journey. It was informed both by my UU values and in alignment with this idea that indigenous cultures have of a kinship with the land. I fostered autonomy for the plants that were previously dominated. And I tried to encourage a restoration, letting them free to be who they were going to be. From a political standpoint, I fostered chaos and anarchy. And yet, even in this supposed lawlessness and unimpeded growth, nature showed that it has some order. There was no heavy loss of native plants by this free growth. There were no unwanted plants. Nothing's a weed. So there was only opportunity for self-expression. I witnessed wonders, joyous and alarming. I watched as fast-growing plants quickly outpaced others in claiming space, yet they still cohabitated. I reveled in the abundant stops that were provided for bees and pollinators. The flowers were just growing up everywhere. I discovered that some naturally cultivated flowers were just growing wild. I learned the names of several of the plants that are usually found on the side of the road that just happened to take residence in the yard, and I gained a better appreciation of why they were there and how they grow where they do. I grew to question the usefulness of the terms native, non-native, and wondered about the cost our land pays in our campaign to dominate it. In short, the flowering and the co-thriving of the so many unwanted varieties amazed me then and continues to inspire awe in me and curiosity today. So I'm talking about UU values, but if you're still not convinced that this kind of experiment is sustainable, there is a less glorious side to this. As much as stewarding the thriving micro-ecosystem was aligning with my worldview, there are some realities living in a culture of domination that stand in firm opposition to flourishing chaos. The land is heavily regulated. Personal property is limited for the majority of humans, and open space is antithetical to a system of oppression which regulates where people can live. Where I am privileged to live, every square inch of land is spoken for, and most people regulate their spaces fastidiously. Although there was no verbal opposition to my weedy experiment from my neighbors, their revealed preferences of cultivated land and garden suggested that the intrusion of a host of different species onto their monocultures over time would not be appreciated and lead to conflict that maybe we could avoid. So my conclusion was the neighborly thing to do was to rein it in, at least. But which were the weeds? Which were fine growing where they are, which were not? How do I decide? This brings me to the reading today from Robin Wall Kimmerer. She spoke to this very notion of what to do when your worldview says all lives are valuable, but then you have to pluck healthy plant life out of the earth. I think this applies to many levels of our beings. Kimmerer claims she was prioritizing. Choose what is most important and discard the rest as needed. For her, the priority was clearing the pond. For me, it was about maintenance, maybe maintaining good relationships with my neighbors, but also maintaining, well, what? What was I trying to maintain? The most efficient and least energy-inducing land management, I think, is what I can conclude with that. So I kept those plants which promoted that, and I weeded out the rest, or at least created a border to trim them down. Prioritizing can be hard when we grow attached to things. Perhaps like me, some of you have helped friends or family downsize, or had to grow through that yourself, and you had to go through a house with someone who could not part with anything, even things that were clearly trash. How do we deal with that? How do we prioritize? Do we prioritize weeding through the mess and throwing out the junk, or addressing the emotions associated with the impact that keeping or tossing will have had on that friend or family member? Or maybe we offer to help that friend or family member cope with the loss by creating a ritual where we celebrate the life of the items and wish them well on their way to the next phase. As we can see, the process of weeding can get very complicated when one develops an appreciation and an affinity for the plants one pulls out. When we engage in others in conversation, which I hope we'll do after the service today, we get more open to learning. We can make more informed decisions that are more beneficial to the affected ecosystems. And this learning isn't just about plants. It affects the above-ground work of justice that we are engaged in as well. So I'm going to leave you with 5 things that I have learned by doing this weedy exploration. 1, if we center our work on worth and dignity, that life is inherently good and centered on the common goods which include and involve all life, then we can work towards restoration and a meaningful cohabitation with our fellow earthly life forms. 2, recognize that we are not doing this work alone. Like it says on our chalice, we are connected. The land doesn't end at property lines because it belongs to all of us, and we are responsible for its stewardship. Recognizing that we all have a part in this means that no one of us should feel like they are alone in this work, or that anyone is without accountability for not doing anything. 3, be curious. While it's important to maintain safe boundaries and follow thought-out priorities, we must always also be open to new possibilities. Ask questions. Don't make assumptions. If new things emerge, let them grow. Sometimes, the very thing we struggle against is also the thing that will help propel us to liberation and a new restoration. 4, dare to live life counterculturally. As you use and people of a liberal religious tradition, we are used to doing things a little differently. This creates in us a resiliency and an active relationship to change. If the culture refuses to change, let us do the work to build one that is more open to change and live into that world. And finally, be open to joy amid the chaos. The climate crisis, economic insecurity, wars, increasing reactive fascism all around the world are real threats, and they cause many of us to lose sleep at night. But there is still beauty and life out there worth celebrating. Let us remind ourselves to appreciate what it is that we live for, what it is that we are fighting for, and what it is that brings us hope. And may we go and connect to that today and every day.